But we'll move on now to our first talk for the evening, and this will be given by Dr. Nathan Bossoh, who is a research fellow and historian from Southampton University. Over the centuries, I think the science and religion field has changed a lot, and there's people here tonight, such as Nick and Dave and James, wherever he's gone, who have done a lot to contribute to our understanding of how that field has changed. And certainly over the last 80 years of our history, a lot of that change has occurred. And Christians in Science and our members have made a lot of contributions to that. But these changes and growing maturity in the field, alongside developments in theology and science themselves, create new opportunities and fresh perspectives for us to be considering. And talking about science and faith then is more like talking about a fantastic living and growing thing rather than just that static body of facts that we must absolutely defend. We can play with it, we can have some fun with it. There's always something new to be thinking about. So thinking around this, we thought it would be useful to ask Nathan to give us a bit of an overview of how things have changed, where that leaves us today, and importantly, what are maybe the next challenges to come. And we had hoped to have Nathan with us in person, but that wasn't possible. So we had hoped to have him streamed in tonight, but that wasn't possible. But we are blessed still with technology, another great gift of God, along with science. So he has recorded his talk for us, and I hope that after you listen to it, that it will spark some really exciting and good conversations when we break afterwards for our coffee and our cake. So let's have a listen to Nathan.
Hello, my name is Nathan Bossoh. I'm a research fellow in history at the University of Southampton, and my talk is entitled Reassessing the Historical Relationship Between Science and Christianity, Scholarship and Representation. And you'll notice, apologies, that my title here is slightly different from what it was on the programme, so apologies for any confusion on my part with that. So, science and religion have been the focus of historical scholarship for over a century. Within this time period, scholars within this field have gone through a range of shifts in approaches to their study of science and religion. This is otherwise known as historiography, or a simpler way to put it might be that the field of history of science and religion itself has a history. This history dates back to the late 19th century and can be broadly understood in three phases. The first phase, which dates from the late 19th century, saw the origins of the conflict thesis between science and religion, largely promoted by the freethinkers, secularists and atheists of this period. In this phase, episodes in the history of science and religion, such as Galileo and the Church and Darwin's theory of evolution, were constructed as a series of clashes in which science always eventually came out on top at the expense of dogmatic religious belief. Although the conflict narrative was challenged throughout the 20th century, the second phase of scholarship really began at the end of the 20th century. This second phase is often represented by John Hedley Brooks' 1991 publication, Science and Religion: Some Historical Perspectives, which brought about a new historiographical shift, now commonly dubbed the complexity thesis. The idea that every instance of science and religion in history has layers of complexity and so cannot simply be reduced to an episode of conflict. Since then, historians of science and religion have completely replaced the conflict thesis with this framework. The third and newest phase within history of science and religion scholarship dates from around 2011. This is the global phase, which is perhaps best represented by the edited book produced in 2011, also by John Hedley Brooks and the late Ronald L. Numbers, entitled Science and Religion Around the World. Since then, a slowly increasing number of historians of science and religion have shifted towards this more global approach. Despite the name being science and religion, during the first two phases, the vast majority of the scholarship has centered mostly around science and Christianity. A key reason for this, pointed out in Peter Harrison's 2015 publication, The Territories of Science and Religion, is because the very terms science and religion are specific products of a Western linguistic development which have not functioned relationally beyond the West, or even in the West, prior to the 19th century. As a result, the modern terms science and religion are inherently tied to a Western Judeo-Christian history. A second connected reason, also pointed out by Harrison, is due to the fact that the conflict thesis itself was predominantly created in Europe and North America, and specifically targeted Western Christianity. Therefore, much of the work since the second phase in 1991 has attended to the dismantling of this false conflict narrative between science and Western Judeo-Christianity. Historians today have virtually overturned the idea of inherent conflict between science and Christianity in favour of a more complex yet positive relationship. As a result, there is a recognisable increase among Christian scientists and Christian apologists today in relation to their confidence in referring back to history to show that Christianity has been a positive motivation for the rise of modern science. It's clear, for example, that the new atheist movement and what used to be their consistent attacks against religion in favour of science has sharply declined in recent years. At both an academic and wider cultural level, global discussions are changing, and this provides us with the opportunity to reassess the questions that we have been asking about science and religion. I would suggest that moving forward, historians, scientists, and apologists must become more cognizant of the political and social landscapes of science and Christianity, particularly in relation to representation. This is important because we see, for example, and as my focus today, that there are clear ethnic disparities in relation to those who take up the sciences. Publication rates are still highest among white counterparts within the field, and we see a sharp decline in the uptake of scientific positions from junior to senior levels among those of Black, Asian, and other minoritized ethnic backgrounds. These disparities are also true within my own field of history as well. What should be pointed out within our particular context here is that these disparities also apply to non-white Christians as well. What we must understand from this is that for many non-white Christians, the championing of the positive relationship between science and Christianity is not necessarily going to be enough to bridge the disparity gap noted above, because the concerns for minoritized ethnicities lay elsewhere. For those groups, concerns and disinterest regarding the sciences may stem from a lack of a sense of belonging, what social scientists term social identity threat. So while it's true to say that the historical relationship between science and Christianity has been shown to be much more positive, we must not forget that the rise of modern science took place within the political and social contextual realities of slavery, empire, nationalism, and so on. Many of the same scientifically minded Christians who contributed to the rise of modern science were also, for example, similarly engaged in the slave trade and/or imperial expansion. Due to time factors, just to take one of numerous cases we could mention, many of us here will know that the Royal Society was established in England in 1660. However, less of us are perhaps aware that the Royal African Company was also established in England in the same year. In 1663, the King of England, King Charles, granted a royal charter to the Royal African Company, in which the charter explicitly sanctioned, quote, the buying and selling, bartering and exchange of, for, and with any Negro slaves, unquote. It's known among historians that members of the Royal Society of London were also members of the Royal African Company, and much activity took place between the two organisations. John Smith, for example, was a member of the Royal Society of London. During the late 17th century, Smith was stationed at a West African slave fort in the Gold Coast as a minister. Alongside his official slave trading ministerial duties at this fort, in his spare time, Smith studied the local botany, recording 10 pages worth of medical ethnobotanical knowledge used by the indigenous African men and women in curing various health issues. None of these plant remedies were known to English or indeed wider European medical doctors at this time. In 1697, the African plant knowledge that Smith recorded was published as a paper in the Royal Society's journal. However, none of the names of the African men and women were mentioned. Instead, the credit regarding these plant medicines went to John Smith and the English apothecary James Petiver. In these ways, and in this instance, we see clear intersections between science, Christianity, and slavery. In my assessment as a Black British historian, these social and political intersections cannot be ignored. In his book, A Multitude of All Peoples, the contemporary church historian Vince Bantu argues that, quote, perhaps the greatest challenge for non-Western/non-white people in coming to faith in Christ today is the association of Christianity as a white/Western religion, unquote. As a science historian myself, I would similarly argue that perhaps the greatest challenge for non-Western/non-white people in taking up the sciences today is the association of science as a white/Western profession. Given this position, I would suggest that while we must continue to champion the reality that science and Christian faith have not historically been opposed, we must remember that this might not be enough of a draw if we want to increase diversity within science. We must be willing to address the colonial past of European science and admit the entanglements of Christianity within this fraught history. Since the third phase in 2011, historians of science and religion have slowly begun to address these difficult histories by aiming to develop a more global picture of the history of science and religion, one that includes global self-knowledge and practice. Efforts as such can create a better sense of belonging for ethnic minorities who will be able to see themselves in the histories that we tell. For Christian ethnic minorities, these more diverse histories mean that on both a religious and ethnic level, they can feel a stronger sense of connection, seeing the production of scientific knowledge as an activity that people like them have been engaged in throughout history. The relationship between Western Judeo-Christianity and the rise of modern science is indeed a positive, if complicated one, and this should continue to be studied and celebrated. As John Hedley Brooks coherently demonstrated in his 1991 book Science and Religion: Some Historical Perspectives, the rise of experimental science, quote, promised a way of reversing the effects of Adam's original sin, a way of making a better world that might in some way mirror the perfection of God's heavenly kingdom, unquote. But alongside this, if we want science to become more inclusive, particularly to ethnic minority Christians, although this of course applies to other intersections such as gender and disability as well, we have to acknowledge the fact that alongside its European Judeo-Christian foundations, modern science took shape within a much broader history, one in which, as James Poskett has argued in his recent book Horizons: A Global History of Science, we see that, quote, science was not the product of a unique European culture. Rather, modern science has always depended upon bringing together people and ideas from different cultures around the world, unquote. In short, both the Christian West and the global South have been foundational to the rise of modern science. And I would argue that discussions surrounding histories of science and religion should reflect this reality. Thank you very much for listening.
I will make sure to pass on your thanks to Nathan. There's quite a few challenges there as we think about going forwards, and we think about how in our hyper-connected global age, these kind of topics and issues we should really be keeping in mind and being more aware of than perhaps we've let ourselves be before.